Welcome back, everyone. This is your friend, Dr. James. We are diving deep again today as we continue our series on the Error of Augustine. This is part 3 of our journey, and if you've been with us for the previous episodes, you know we're looking at a pivotal moment in church history. How Augustine of Hippo shifted theology away from the early church consensus and imported ideas from Manichaeism, Neo-Platonism, and Stoicism. Before we get started, I want to make sure I give credit where it is due. The material we are covering today comes from the extensive research and lectures of Dr. Ken Wilson. We are indebted to his scholarship for bringing these historical realities to light, and I want you to know that the lectures and illustrations we'll be discussing are drawn directly from his work. So let's pick up where we left off. We've looked at the new realities of original sin, but today we're going to look at the loss of the libero arbitrio, the free will that Augustine originally posited but later abandoned. Now, it's important to remember that Augustine was famous for being a great writer against heresies. He argued against the Donatists in one period, he argued against the Manichaeans in another, and he argued against the Pelagians in yet another. He was incredibly respected for his ability to debate, and honestly, that shouldn't come as a surprise. Why? Because Augustine was a professional rhetorician. Think of him as a professional debater or speaker. He was trained to win arguments. In fact, he was arguably more of a rhetorician than he was a Bible scholar. As Dr. Wilson points out, Augustine himself admitted in his comments to Jerome that he wished he had possessed more time to actually study the scriptures. But here is where the tension lies. His arguments against the Manichaeans, where he insisted there is a free will, are a complete about-face from his later arguments against the Pelagians, where he essentially says, we need to be deterministic because humans don't know what they're doing. Let's look at his anti-Manichaean position first. It was strongly in favor of free will. Listen to what he wrote against the Manichaeans. But by nature, souls can in no way be evil. Remember, the Manichaeans believed souls were evil by nature. Augustine continues, whence do we teach this? From the above definitions of will and sin. For to speak of souls and that they are evil and they do not sin is full of madness. But to say that they sin without will is great craziness. And to hold anyone guilty of sin for not doing what he could not do belongs to the height of iniquity and insanity. Wow! Let that sink in. Augustine is saying that if you hold someone responsible for sin when they literally couldn't help themselves, that is the height of insanity. And honestly, I agree 100% with that version of Augustine. But sadly, that is exactly what he is going to do later in his career. He says elsewhere, consequently, either the will itself is ultimately the cause of sin or the ultimate cause of sin is without sin. Sin can be justly imputed to no one but a sinner and can therefore only be justly imputed to one who wills it. So in his works like On True Religion or Genesis Against the Manichaeans, he is consistent. But then we hit Ad Simplicianum 2. That is the turning point. That is where the determinism creeps in. He starts arguing against election based on God's foreknowledge of good works, something every Christian author prior to him believed. He writes that good works are part of justification. Even faith is a gift from God. Now, Dr. Wilson points out something fascinating here. Who was the first person to actually claim that faith was a gift from God in this sense? It wasn't a Christian apostle. It was Basilides the Gnostic back in the 2nd century. Augustine writes, if Jacob had faith because he willed it, then God did not give him faith as a free gift, but Jacob gave it to himself. This is a massive shift. He completely changes free will into a new definition. He also totally misunderstands Romans 9 regarding Jacob and Esau. This is still a huge problem today. People read Romans 9 and see individuals, one going to heaven, one going to hell. But if you look at the context, go back to Malachi, go back to Genesis, the text says, 2 nations are in your womb. Augustine missed the context completely, interpreting temporal earthly matters as eternal damnation or bliss. In Ad Simplicianum the two, Augustine's view of free will mutates. He redefines it as the proper choosing of good resulting from being moved by God's superintending grace that irresistibly coerced mankind's will. Friends, that is not free will. That is God divinely manipulating the human person to get what he wants. This brings us to what Dr. Wilson calls the duped position, the anti-Pelagian stance, D.U.P.E.D. It stands for Divine Unilateral Predetermination of Individuals' Eternal Destinies. This was a view held by Stoics, Gnostics, and Manichaeans, pagans. No Christian had taught this previously. So how did Augustine explain this? How do you explain a God who chooses one person and not another arbitrarily? How do you explain why one innocent child dies and goes to hell because they didn't make it to the baptismal font, while another child, perhaps born to a prostitute, is eternally saved just because they got dumped in the water? Augustine's answer: you must refer the matter then to the hidden determinations of God. He says that when you see one infant assisted to baptism and another not assisted so that he dies in bondage, meaning he goes to hell, it's because of God's hidden determination. If you talk to Calvinists today, you often get the same answer. It's a mystery. God's ways are higher than our ways. Augustine writes that God turns them whithersoever he wills and whensoever he wills, to bestow kindness on some and to heap punishment on others, as he himself judges right by a counsel most secret to himself. This idea actually comes from Plotinus and Neo-Platonism, which taught that God is above everything, so whatever he does is righteous even if it looks evil to us. But there is a problem with that thinking for those of us made in the image of God. Augustine even admits his change of mind. He says, "When I began my books on free choice, I still doubted the condemnation of infants not born again." He says, "I had not yet very carefully sought, nor had I as yet found what is the nature of the election of grace." He admits he switched his view. Now, how did he reconcile this switch? He tried to argue he wasn't a fatalist, but Dr. Wilson explains that Augustine did this by redefining fatalism strictly as astrology, fate controlled by the stars. So Augustine essentially argues, if the stars do it, it's pagan fate. If God does it, even if it's the exact same mechanic of determinism, we call it grace. He tried to say free will still exists, but he redefined it to mean it only works when infused by God. And then, in his retractions, he claims, "I tried hard to maintain the free decision of the human will, but the grace of God was victorious." As Dr. Wilson notes, that wasn't the grace of God, folks. That was the grace of Manichaean heresy, a grace that is imposed, not offered in love. And don't believe the claim that everyone agreed with him. That is simply not true. Jerome, the man who wrote the Latin Vulgate, opposed him. Jerome said, "It rests with ourselves either to sin or not to sin, and to put the hand either to good or evil, and thus free will is preserved." Jerome believed we need God's help, absolutely, but that we have the power to desire and choose. The Christians in Gaul, modern-day France, also opposed Augustine. They viewed his brand of predestination as erroneous, if not downright dangerous. Why? Because he changed the meaning of the biblical word predestination. So what was Augustine's final theology? It's essentially what we know today as TULIP. 1. Total depravity, the inability of the human will to even believe. 2. Unconditional election. God chooses arbitrarily, like picking between two infants. 3. Limited atonement. Christ couldn't have died for everyone, or else the Stoic God would have saved everyone. Or irresistible grace. And here, I want to use an illustration from Dr. Ken Wilson. It's like a rat in a maze. The rat might hit some dead ends, but God has manipulated the maze so the rat will eventually get to the cheese. It's inevitable. 5. Perseverance of the saints. This was invented to explain why some baptized infants grow up to be faithful and others grow up to live like the devil. Augustine concluded God must give a second gift of perseverance to the lucky ones. This is the theology of John Calvin and the Calvinists, rooted in Augustine's later years. So, as we wrap up part 3, we have to ask, where do we place our trust? Do we trust one man, influenced by pagan philosophy, mistranslations, and Manichaeism? Or do we look at the first 300 years of church history, over 86 early church fathers, who all argued against determinism? You have to have a lot of faith to believe Augustine. This is why, as we always say, you must do your theology in order: historical theology first, then biblical theology, then systematic theology. If you skip the history, you might not realize that the verses used to support determinism today were actually arguments used by Manichaean heretics that Augustine later adopted. Reformed theology was founded on a false pagan anthropology. And because the view of man and sin is wrong, the view of salvation is sadly mistaken. And that is why we at Grace School of Theology teach justification by faith alone, by grace, and not by the Manichaean pagan grace of Augustine. If you like this podcast, please share and subscribe. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.